The framework for our conversation today is how do we keep the momentum going on reform in healthcare in this post-ACA environment? And we've invited plans to this conversation, recognizing obviously there are other parts of the system, there are other perspectives on the system. Plans are not the entirety of the system. But we thought that having different perspectives across lines of business, Medicaid, commercial exchange, et cetera, and different sorts of players within this cohort would be helpful and telling, in part because these plans all do take a system level approach. Some of the systems are different by line of business and definition, but I want to recognize that there are other voices that have opinions on reform. That said, Andy, thank you to Kaiser for being one of our sponsors. I appreciate it. I don't know if you knew that before we talked here a half hour ago, but thank you anyway to Kaiser generally. Let me ask you sort of this first question. Do you feel like reform is losing some of its momentum? You know, I feel like prior to the ACA in the mid-aughts, there was some lethargy in some parts of the healthcare system. Kaiser has never been a system that I think has been lethargic. I think it's been an innovative force for some time, at least in the Northwest. But are we, and that was sort of, reform and innovation was catalyzed by the Affordable Care Act discussion. Are we entering a period where we're a little more lethargic as a system, or are we entering a period where we're going to maybe be reinvigorated because of macro and other things coming down the pipe?
Well, my point of view is that the fundamental problem that exists in terms of America's healthcare has not gone away, even with the coverage expansion. And there's been a recent Kaiser Family Foundation study that came out in no relation to Kaiser Permanente. It's an independent organization which basically is showing that the healthcare coverage for a family of 4, the cost is now, I think, eclipsed $25,000 a year or something along that line. So the clock is ticking as it relates to a fundamental problem that we have in this country, that we still haven't solved the problem of affordable, high-quality health care in this state or in this country. And anyone that kind of hides behind the partisan bickering of the ACA, anyone that kind of tries to take this down a rat hole, basically is missing the big point, and I call it the BFO, the blinding flash of the obvious, is that we have to come up with a better approach to providing affordable, high-quality care for all of our citizens, not just Medicaid recipients in this country. Because otherwise, what will end up happening is we will basically sap the resources of any general fund in any state, any federal budget, basically to consume it in healthcare. And while I'm part of that industry and business, I care very deeply about infrastructure. I care very deeply about education. I care very deeply, as I think everybody in this room does, about a variety of other things that our government should be there to fund for. So I would say that we need to take pause. We need to understand what's worked and what hasn't, and get ready for the next cycle of reform. Mm-hmm.
Eric, also thank you to Care Oregon for being a sponsor. I appreciate that very much. And let me ask you maybe a similar kind of question, but do you feel like at Care Oregon, I mean, Care Oregon was deeply engaged prior to your role, but continuing under your leadership, deeply engaged in transformation in Oregon. Do you feel like the healthcare house is on fire? Or is that an overstatement? Because we might be just fine if we continue on the path, and sometimes you have to implement and not strategize.
Yeah, I don't know that I think the house is on fire. I believe the fireplace is blazing, and there are folks who have pushed curtains closer to it than ought to be. So there's an opportunity for it to be on fire. So our job is to move that rug away, open up the damper, let's get some air and get it flowing, because the challenge is going to be, it's going to be financial. I mean, elephant in the room, it's going to be financial. And I think, to the earlier question, the system as a whole probably did get a little complacent, because when the ACA came on, half people said it's going to be a disaster, so ignore it. Half people said it's going to be a panacea, so don't worry about anything else. For a couple of years, everybody was right. now everybody's wrong. And so, now that states are looking at the differences in financing from the federal share changing, and the people on the exchange are starting to actually show up for services which they didn't at the first year or two. It changes the dynamic of the exchange business and the Medicaid business to understand where people are going. It puts a lot of pressure on providers. So I think if we don't get a handle, as Andy said, on the continuum of care, how do we really provide good quality, high value care that meets the needs of the people, then it's a good chance of the fire growing.
That's a great comment, Craig. I'll turn to you. That after the ACA, whether you like the ACA or not, everyone was right, and now everyone's wrong. I think there's probably a lot there to unpack. But on the notion of, those entities that said the ACA is right and we're going to buy in and we're going to invest and we're going to go with it. MOTA, I think, is at the top of that list in Oregon of organizations that embraced both in Medicaid on the exchange, the Affordable Care Act, and then ran into some challenges as many other plans did. And non-plans as well, providers, what do you think are some of the lessons from these last 6 years since 2010 that MOTA has sort of culled from this experience of having really embraced and then shifted and adjusted as a result of learning?
How much time do I have?
Yeah. Make sure his mic's up. Quick, get the mic up. Sorry.
Well, I understand the question, and I think we have learned a lot, having embraced the individual market the way we did, the ACA. And I think it goes without saying, the population that was covered wasn't what we expected. I don't think that's unique in Oregon. I think that's true across the country. There were some unfortunate things that happened along the way. We didn't have the market size didn't materialize as we'd hoped. There were some changes with who was actually entering in 2014 compared to what we expected. But what we have gleaned along the way is a lot of information and data about the population.
Yeah.
And we've been able to use that information to reach out to providers and establish a new model for the ACA population going into 2017. And it's a critical time right now because, as many people know, the risk mitigation programs go away. 2 of the 3 go away in 2017. So we're really on our own going into 17. So we've had to look at a different approach going forward because what happened in the past wasn't working.
Yeah.
And what we've established is something different as far as our product, something different as far as our provider panel or our network, something different about the care management model that we're using. And getting all those pieces in place has been very critical. And we've learned a lot getting us there. We're very optimistic about how this will go forward into 2017. But it doesn't go without saying that it's going to be somewhat problematic because we've had to pull out of some regions to make this model work, and that does cause disruption. So a lot of what we're working through now and going into open enrollment is making sure that we have as clean of a transition as we possibly can as we go into 17.
Because MOTO's in multiple lines of business, Medicaid and the commercial and exchange marketplaces, maybe offer an example or two of where the engagement in the Medicaid and the CCO world has informed the kind of thinking that you have and strategies that you employ in the commercial and marketplace world.
Sure, yeah. So because we are involved in a CCO, and there's payment reform in our Eastern Oregon CCO in the sense of we have a risk model, which is an alternate payment method, not traditional fee-for-service. So we've used that with our Eastern Oregon CCO, and we've actually incorporated that in our commercial products. So with some of our major payers through our system of care model. So we've done that already with commercial. With the individual market, we're looking at a different payment methodology too. So these payment methodologies, working with providers, getting them engaged, and also creating some transparency between how the premium is set, where the dollars are, and how the providers ultimately get reimbursed has been a big learning for us. Yeah. It wasn't that long ago that the the actual negotiation of the contract was done separately from the work that was done by the actuaries in pricing. And we've been able to pull that together so there is more of that transparency so that the providers actually can see where the premium dollar is set, because in Medicaid, that dollar is set. There's a cap. And we're finding in these other markets, the dollar is set. And we can work with the providers to say, well, this is how much the premium dollar is, and this is what's available for care. Yeah. And trying to create more of a system there.
So Angela, as you know, part of the discussion of the Affordable Care Act was that it would help unleash the power of the consumer through exchanges and other mechanisms. And Cambia, Regents is obviously a part of the Cambia family, made a real bet on consumer activation in the way of its healthcare service companies that's in its portfolio. But we haven't really seen as much consumer activation as I think people envisioned in those discussions. What have we learned about hoping for consumer activation and not quite seeing it? And how do we move that needle so that consumers are more engaged in this healthcare conversation?
So we've learned quite a bit about how consumers actually engage in the healthcare model through the exchanges. Unfortunately, they've picked the lowest price option almost resoundingly each and every time, 60 to 70% of the time. And that's because learning how to purchase healthcare in the individual space is new. It's new for most of these consumers. It's something they haven't done historically, if you think 5 years ago, pre-exchange. And so they don't really understand how to evaluate health plans, what the service model looks like, what the network models that you mentioned look like. How do we evaluate that? And then on the exchange, a lot of that's sort of masked in terms of if you've gone to the exchange, it's a very confusing space. And we've done some focus groups with individuals to find out how do you make decisions and what's influencing your decisions. And unfortunately, most of it is price. Now, we understand why. Price is important to all of us, right? We want a good deal. Think about your Amazon experience. When you go to Amazon to buy a service, you look at 2 or 3 different versions of that product. You compare, right? And so they're looking at it from that lens in terms of price becomes really the heavyweight factor in that. But that'll start to pivot as people start to understand that there are differences within the carriers. And we're starting to get some of that feedback right now. If I had known my provider wasn't going to be in the network, or if I knew that it was going to be a different type of network, so on and so forth, they may have chosen or thought more carefully about it. But healthcare decisions and choices are hard. Think about your own personal healthcare. The healthcare experience isn't an easy one. When you go to schedule an appointment, it takes an average of 2.5 weeks. You sit in 37 minutes of traffic to get there on average. These are national statistics. Once you're there, you're 62 minutes in the office and you're 12 minutes with a doctor. That is far from a satisfactory consumer experience. And so we'll start to see people actually engaging more heavily, not only in the choices that they make around their healthcare company, but their providers and what kind of services that they're going to expect to see from those providers. So that new generation in technology that allow us to see more carefully into that will really change the way people engage in the healthcare model. And I think that's a good thing.
I often I regularly argue that if we think that there is healthcare illiteracy in America, that whatever that literacy rate is, health system literacy is even lower.
Yes. Yeah.
And it makes consumer activation really tough. One of the mainstream narratives that's emerging is that PPOs in a post-ACA world are not effective network models, though they are good for choice. And that a more HMO or Medicaid managed care organization or CCO model in Oregon is probably the chassis upon which success can be built in the exchange or commercial market. But those are to some degree reliant on either employer choice to pick Kaiser or some health system literacy. First, do you think that's accurate, this sort of PPO versus HMO split in that narrative? And then, how does that, what implications does that have for consumers that may have a limited choice if they want to have a price competitive product?
So the PPO network is what most employers, which is about 48% of the United States, get their coverage through their employer. On average, it is, in general, a PPO. I'm not saying that's necessarily the case across the country. There are pockets that it varies and is different. And there's different demand and need in different parts of the country. And I could spend a lot of time on that, but I'll stop there. Just assume in general it's around that PPO. And it's because employees have gotten accustomed and employers have gotten accustomed to the fact that that's sort of been the state of contracts for the commercial market space for about the last 20 years. But I think that's about to change, because on the individual side, where we have value-based or CCO type contracts in the individual market space, and that market space is growing. And then you have MACRA, which I think you've all been in a session earlier today, and I was told it was standing room only, so there's some pretty high interest in that. And then MACRA is going to also put some of those value-based contracting requirements in place, and that's 52% of the market space. And now you're sort of pushing on both ends in terms of the individual market space will be involved in those value-based contracting. You have the federal population that'll be moving, or government-based population that'll be moving in there. And then you have this employer space in between. The employers are sort of tipping their toes in this water. They're interested, they're curious. I was just talking to an employer this morning around where they want to lower or bend their trend curve. And I said, well, the way to do that is in these value-based type contracting. And so they're looking at it, but they want to see who goes first. They're not 100% sure they want to be the first one. Now, there's some very progressive employers who want to jump in that space. But for the most part, I think we're about 6 months away from a tipping point where they're really going to start to realize and understand what that means, which will then change the consumer experience within those networks.
Yeah. So, Eric, let me ask you, you've been here in Oregon 6 months?
4 months.
4 months? A few months?
It seems longer.
Let me ask you first, just open-ended, what surprises you maybe about Oregon that you didn't know, Oregon healthcare generally, that you didn't know coming in?
Yeah. You know, I think that I actually was a bit familiar with the system here. Oregon has always been upfront and progressive. And the state I was at before this was Massachusetts, and there's a lot of similarities in the kinds of programs they put forward, the way they sort of go out of their way to make sure services are there and benefits are out there. So a lot of that was there. I think if there was anything that might have surprised me, it probably was the level of cooperation among entities that traditionally would compete against each other on a number of fronts, not just from a marketing membership standpoint, but from a network standpoint or a center of excellence standpoint or a legislative sort of regulatory standpoint. And and I think Andy and I talk all the time about some good things, some bad things, but we're talking about how do we enhance the system as a whole. And I think the CCO model, at least in the Medicaid business, I found it to be sort of amazing, really. I mean, I think it changes the dynamic of managed care on the Medicaid side, going from an underwriting profit motive, which it typically is in most places for these plans, to a community-based, enhancing the needs of the community and the members basis. And I think those are fundamental differences. And I'm not sure that I truly understood how entrenched that was in not just a couple of entities, but not the CCOs and the providers and even the legislators and folks that we've talked to. So I was pleasantly surprised by that.
Yeah. Andy, I won't give you quite the same softball that I just gave Eric, but
Thank you.
He talked about the collaboration and folks getting along, and I think that exists to some extent until you hit the border. There's some antipathy to inviting in, particularly in the next CCO procurement, plans from out of state to come and participate in that next procurement. I think Governor Kitzhaber has been pretty emphatic in his suggestion that future procurement, like the previous one, is based on a local community organization. And I think Kaiser is well recognized, even though it may have a headquarter. This is out of state. This is, I think, perceived as very much a local, and is a local plan. What do you think about the notion of opening procurement to the best and brightest ideas, regardless of for-profit, nonprofit, whether they're based here, not based here? What do you think?
It's a free country. You know, I truly believe that. I think that we get better based upon the competition and building off of each other. We learn from our colleagues in the marketplace what works and what doesn't. So we haven't really thought about it. It's occupied very little of the space that we think about as relates to how do we better serve the market. Because at the end of the day, the real winners in the marketplace will be those entities that can successfully partner with the care delivery systems. And I think, as Craig was mentioning a little bit earlier, what they've learned is something we've been trying to do for many, many years, is then to have shared risk models. Our problem in this community isn't having so much insurance providers out there. It's the fact that there are links into how to make sure that the care is delivered in the appropriate way and at a cost-effective way. We have an imbalance in terms of the risk. Insurers are taking the risk, at least in the CCO. And the CCO model is kind of proven when we sit at the table and we've got the delivery systems and the insurers there sharing in the risk, then we have the incentives that are aligned and the like. I would say that, I have a great amount of respect for out-of-state entities coming in. I think the reason why they haven't come in to the extent that they have in other marketplaces, I think is a reflection of the strong local players that we have here. This is a unique market for Kaiser in the sense that in other marketplaces we have a lot more United, a lot more Aetna, a lot more Cigna, and here they have a presence, but we have a tradition of strong, locally owned, the Regents, the Care Oregons, the MODAs or whatever, that have really established a pretty strong beachhead. But like I say, it's a free country. Bring it on.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think, Eric, about that question? Care Oregon have the same opinion?
I think philosophically, yes. I think Andy's right. I think with the right guardrails, I think it is a free country, but these are public dollars. These are funds that are expended to serve the most vulnerable population out there. These are initiatives that we undertake that aren't just necessarily dealing with how do we pay this physician or that hospital or that therapy provider, but how do we touch the whole person to successfully weave together success for the community. So with the social determinants work, the ACEs, getting into housing and food insecurities and, all those other things that, given sort of pure free enterprise, for lack of a better term, I think that would be in jeopardy. I think I've worked for one of the huge nationwide companies that just recently came into the market, and they have good programs. They have great programs. They do good work, but their incentives are different. Their priorities are different. But if you can have the CCO structure with enhancements about how we use resources, how the governance decisions are made, where ultimately that money lives, does it get refocused into the community for upstream long-term benefits of the community, or does it go to build a new headquarters somewhere in a private airplane? I mean, I wasn't going to mention this location, but yeah, I mean, they live very well there. I worked for them. They'd send a car and put you up at the Ritz-Carlton every time you came by. I don't know that that's necessarily the best utilization of very limited resources that folks work very hard to earn and to serve. So I think that, who owns these entities, I don't particularly worry about if there are safeguards around securing the fact that these are public funds, they're for the public good, and the idea isn't to get rich.
Yeah.
I
mean, I don't think the idea in Medicaid is to get rich.
Yeah,
So-
I just want to build upon that. Is that on the one hand we want we don't mind the competition. We think we'll fare well. What is of biggest concern is that if you think about our stewardship or our guardianship over the most vulnerable people in our communities, okay, which is which is a very, very important kind of concept that got the CCO started in the first place. What we know is that the expansion of Medicaid into this population deals with some, but not all of the issues and the problems, because the acute care medical setting, in terms of our total health model, what we've come to recognize in Kaiser Permanente, and I think others have as well, is that addresses some of the issues, but certainly not all those. So this is one of the reasons why this past Friday, organizations that are in the CCOs here in the Portland metro area did something that I think is quite revolutionary. We came together with a local agency here to fund 400 units of housing for the most vulnerable parts of our population. And we see the CCOs and the ability to kind of generate funds to be a very, very important catalyst to create more transformational change in the drivers that are causing some people to be less healthy or less successful than others. Now, so I think that, I may have to amend, based on my counsel here from Eric, I may have to amend my statement to say you can't come in and then raid the Treasury and send it out of state. You have to stay with us on the issues that are really, really profound. And if you don't think they're there, just watch the next street corner that you come to.
Yeah.
And so I like the competition. I don't think that they have license to take our revenues, our tax revenues, and pull them out and away from the very, very people for which these funds were directed.
So Angela, I want to ask what I see as a peripherally related, but related nevertheless, question about market consolidation. Mm-hmm. And Oregon has been relatively decentralized, particularly on the plan side. Mm-hmm. I think that's increasingly less the case on the provider side. But the ACA seems to have catalyzed this market consolidation activity. Should there be fewer plans in Oregon in order to have a little more pressure, a little more volume to be able to push back against some of the provider consolidation that is in many cases, according to particularly former Massachusetts Attorney General, where she's a study that she says that price is 75% market leverage and not actually cost. It's 25% cost. So if we're having consolidation on the provider side, is it time to have more consolidation on the plan side?
Well, I could spend a lot of time on that. There was a lot in that question.
Yeah. Take any piece you want.
I moved here 4 years ago, and right before I moved here, I did an assessment of the marketplace to really get a sense of how many carriers are here, what does the competition look like Andy and Eric talked about. And we have a tremendous number of carriers in the state, and at that time we had even more. And what happens is you really just have to it's a simple math equation, frankly. We have 3.9 million people. We have 12 commercial carriers in the market. We have X number of CCOs. I don't pretend to know that number, but it's large. And you divide it all out, and the number of people per carrier, it's not evenly spread, for example, but you have to have a certain volume with each carrier in order to manage the risk. You have to spread the risk over the population, right? And if you don't have enough population to spread that risk, you will not be sustainable as a carrier. And just this year alone, we lost 3 carriers. We lost 2 co-ops. LifeWise pulled out of the marketplace. And reflecting back 4 years to now, there's been tremendous change in the market space. I think 5 years from now, it's going to look completely different again. There's just a lot of transition that's taking place. ACA has created a tremendous amount of disruption in the marketplace in terms of understanding risk and really trying to get an assessment of how you place value on that risk. As Craig was talking about, how do people buy now? What kind of population is now coming into the healthcare system that we've not seen before, and how do you manage that risk? So there's a lot of unknowns in the market space. And then also back to your earlier question, other carriers coming in from outside, coming in into the state, then creates even more disruption through that. We're almost in this settling phase where I think the fewer population or the fewer carriers that we have right now and spread that risk over a greater population will create some sustainability long-term. But I do think the landscape in the market is going to change. 5 years from now, it's not going to look like what it looks like today.
So Craig, any observations on this question as it relates to having a hospital partner? Pacific Source and Legacy have partnered, OHSU and MOTA have developed a partnership. That's a different kind of consolidation. It's not really consolidation, but it's a different kind of affiliation integration. How does that fit into this conversation?
Well, I think just to build on the question generally, I think the way it's framed, it's fairly narrowly viewed through the medical insurance market within Oregon. And I think a lot of our organizations do business outside of Oregon, outside of the medical insurance business, outside of, for example, we do a lot of dental business. So I think that as far as looking at the companies and consolidation, I think you have to look at them more broadly in all the businesses that they're in. And that's one way that we view partnerships too, is that partnerships simply extend our reach in some markets and bring in potentially more resources to expand in certain lines of business. So I think that's a way that some companies can stay relevant or stay in certain markets, is to create those partnerships. And there's interest on both sides, clearly too, because I think health systems, and historically have, I think, been interested in starting insurance companies, but there's a certain level of investment that you have to make there, and an alternative to that is to partner with a health plan as well. So it works both ways.
How do you think, I know you're deeply engaged in the product development side also. Angela keeps talking about 5 years from now, and when I think of 5 years from now, I think that 5 years ago, we had just passed, 6 years ago, it passed the Affordable Care Act. We just passed MACRA here about 18 months ago. 5 years from now, I think we'll be swimming in, one might argue, swimming in the MACRA acronyms in the same way that we're swimming in the ACA acronyms today. What impact do you see MACRA having on the Medicaid and commercial lines of business, even though it's primarily a CHIP and Medicare reform bill?
I think clearly it's on the payment model. Fee-for-service is not, it's creating pressure to change from the fee-for-service model, pay for value rather than for volume. So I think that's been a positive impact of MACRA and the other reform initiatives, and we've seen it cross. Again, I think part of these reforms, CPC Plus is a good example, because part of the requirement there was it expanded it to clinics just beyond just Medicare, but to all payers. So you create some volume from all payers, whether it's commercial or individual or Medicaid or Medicare. So you can get some volumes around these payment methodologies. And I think that's a positive, and we'll see that in the commercial space too.
Angela, similar question, because we were talking before, and you had sort of set up this framework where the pressure from MACRA and sort of the groundswell of things like pricing and ACOs will pinch employers in the commercial market to change. Employers are sort of like consumers in that they're this great hope for the system that one day they'll become really activated and they'll force change. I don't really see that either. What are you, so far?
To get the employer activated?
Yeah, so that the employers are demanding more ROI out of their healthcare spend. I mean, you're dealing with employers all the time, or Regencies. What observations, are employers coming along? Are they demanding more? Are they getting creative, or are they just, to your point earlier, just interested in price?
I wouldn't say they're just interested in price. There's an interesting dynamic that's happening right now that's sort of pushing off some of this value-based, really embracing those concepts, and that is the economy's improved. Their top line is going gangbusters, or relatively well anyways. Also, unemployment rate in Oregon is 5.4%. 5% is full employment, meaning you have a really hard time finding employees. And we're right at that cusp. So what employers really are focused on right now is attracting and retaining the right talent. And there's sort of now sort of the storm around the war for talent. And so they're really focused on that, and they really want to give the employees what they want so they can keep their populations happy. Past pay and vacation and so forth and perks in the organization benefits is usually number 3 in their deciding factor. So they don't want to create disruption, DJ, to your point, but at the same time, that's today. Profile out a couple years where MACRA is forcing some of these relationships with providers and payers, as we've talked about, and that'll continue, as well as the individual base will also create some change. Employers will eventually be in a space where this isn't not an unknown for the consumer, and they'll start to embrace it because others around them are experiencing it and having a good experience within those type of payment models. And so I do think employers, they're interested in it, but they have other things taking their attention right now, and allowing them to maybe set this concept aside for a period of time. But I think that this is going to shift once the consumers start to really see the value of those value-based type payment models. And when the providers are 50% of their compensation is going to be based on these type of payment models, because think of the populations that'll be driven through MACRA in the individual market space, the providers are going to want this as well. And when they're talking to their patients and they're talking to the consumer who's making decisions, there'll be a lot of information that'll help sort of move that population from where they are today.
I'd like to ask you all a yes/no question. I recognize that can sometimes be unfair, so if you want to say, I don't know, that's okay also. But as a principle, is there enough money in healthcare? Eric, down the line, you want to start? Yes, no, or I don't know? And I have a follow-up question.
A follow-up too, huh? No, I think if you include what I consider the entire sort of pantheon of healthcare, not just sort of what we deal with, but you throw in long-term care and palliative, and then I think yes, I think there's enough money.
I know it's a gross oversimplification, but be gross with me for a second. Andy, what do you think?
I would say that I want to leave high-cost pharmaceuticals to the side here, okay, because this is a big issue.
Yeah.
And that's not fair to include them in. But for the rest of this, as it relates to, if you take a big systemic kind of view of all the resources that we're pouring in,
right,
we have enough money. We're just using it in the wrong way.
Right. Craig, what do you think?
I would say yes, there's enough money in the healthcare system.
Yeah. Angela, what do you think?
I say yes with the caveat that if we can manage the 30% that's typically considered waste, so duplication of services and services that aren't necessary, yes, there's room in the system.
So my follow-up question is about culture as it relates to that, because I would argue that if you think there's not enough money in healthcare, then the answer to that problem is we need more money in healthcare. And that's a pretty linear challenge, right? If A, then B. And I think that in healthcare generally, we train people to be specialists in their field, and as a consequence are often relatively linear. Look for symptom, diagnosis. And I think that if we have enough money, then the solution is a non-linear solution. And we don't train people terribly well in healthcare for non-linear thinking. And so my question is, and Eric, because you made the mistake to catch my eye, so I'll ask you first, but I'm interested in all of your thinking on this. How do we build in your organizations a culture of nonlinear thinking that can solve the problems that we face within our organizations, within the system overall?
You know, that's actually an easier one probably for me, I think, because Care Oregon by construct and by DNA, that's sort of what we do. I mean, we are, I report to a board of directors and that's it. There's no corporate somewhere. This is Care Oregon. This is what we do for the people we do it for. And I think there's a history of innovation and looking for ways to say, how do we look long term? I mean, we have the luxury of not having to necessarily worry about this budget or even the next budget. You know, I've got a little leeway, not unlimited. So if there are any board members here, not unlimited, I get that. but there is more leeway, and and so we can unleash entire departments that are. We have an idea lab of people that are dedicated to looking for ways to enhance care and productivity in the system for our employees and for our providers. I mean, those are the kind of sort of luxuries I have, so I don't know if it's necessarily a fair question for me. I think I have different pressures as Care Oregon, and so I mean, I love it though.
I would say
Please.
that it's not a linear, thinking about this question, it's not to get away from linear thinking, we have to think about systems thinking, okay? Let me give you a few examples from, our kind of environment. This is not, the insurance function in our company simply provides a set of economic incentives that aligns the interests of the providers back to the people that are buying the insurance product. And the people that are buying the insurance product expect a number of things from us. First and foremost, because we're in the business of healthcare, they expect extraordinarily high quality. So we start there as it relates to the underlying structure and construct of our care delivery system. And we usually use NCQA or Medicare 5-star, and you can look it up. You'll find that Kaiser Permanente in the Northwest is by far, in both Oregon and Washington, the #1 plan as it relates to clinical quality. Number two is that we have to deliver that care in an affordable fashion. And we've had lots of conversations today about the ACA, what happened, what should have happened, or whatever. And it's clear that there was risk out there that nobody really knew what they were getting into. Our point of view on that back then is we didn't know what we didn't know. We held back. And I think all of us have learned over time that the pricing had to be rational in terms of the underlying risk profile of the community. And I'm sure Craig could tell you chapter and verse about that. The third area is that we have to basically be able to provide high quality service to the member. We have to basically be able to reach out to members and be able to understand, anticipate, and engage them, because a lot of the challenges here as it relates to, let's just say, for instance, we had enough money, we got rid of the 30%. There's also this underlying kind of ecology around what our members are thinking about in terms of their care and what they own. I would just tell you that, and this is in Portland, Oregon, USA, where we think of this as the healthiest city, or one of the healthiest cities around, that we have a place that is thought of as very cool and very hip called Lardo. Okay? It's a sandwich place. I mean, they're basically, and it's a great place, by the way, and I've been there once or twice, but I limit, it's once a year kind of thing. But we have underlying kind of issues that our communities, the people that we're trying to serve, we have to have our patients and our members take more responsibility for this, because regardless of how much money there is, regardless of whether the quality is good or whatever, is that my responsibility for my personal health is in many ways, shape, or form going to dictate what Craig or others have to calculate in terms of the underlying premium. And I think we need to also be mindful of that. And the last thing I will say, though, is that in some cases, and this goes back to the transformation work, there are some people that need help to get out of the cycle of poverty and despair. And these are this is what I worry about, is like close to 50% of the babies born in Oregon, I think it was last year, were Medicaid babies, okay? And they start out with a disadvantage, and I'm just saying this, is that if we don't figure out a way to get them ready to learn and to basically stay in their cycle in the educational system, and that's all of our responsibility, we will never have enough money for healthcare. So this is what I'm saying is that it's not a linear, we have to get systems to work better together to continue to make this place live up to the reputation that this is a great place to live.
Yeah. I thought you were going to talk about fluoride in water, but I see you didn't go there. Angela, Craig, we're out of time, or almost out of time. Let me just ask you for a synopsis in terms of organizational leadership and your thinking as leaders and how to navigate this time, or navigate your organization in this time. What advice would you give to the leaders in the audience based on your experience? Craig, I'll start with you. In a one snippet, what is the advice that they should keep in mind as they try to navigate their organizations moving forward?
I think one is not to fall back into patterns from the past. I mean, we've definitely gone over we've transitioned into a new era. And I think secondly, you have to build partnerships with people that you maybe formerly didn't have such strong partnerships. And I think trust and partnership is very important for this era.
Angela, advice for the community?
My advice would be pretty simple. Get out of the box. In our organization, when we come up against a challenge or there's a new opportunity, it's easy to fall in what you already know and do what you've done. But really stop and think about it from a different angle and from a different perspective. How would the consumer want to be dealt with in this problem and in this space? And what is it that we can do that may be traditional that can solve their problems, but more importantly, get outside the box to see if you can solve that problem. And that is a cultural shift within our organization, and it's had profound impact on our ability to actually engage the member in their healthcare decisions.
Let's give them a round of applause. Eric Hunter, CEO of Care Oregon, Annie McCulloch, President at Kaiser Permanente Northwest, Craig Anderson, Senior Vice President at Moda Health, and Angela Dowling, President at Regents Blue Cross Blue Shield. Thank you all.